So again, welcome everyone. This is What You Need to Know, COVID Compensatory Services, CCS versus Extended School Year, ESY. The date is February 10th, 2021. We are presenting this via webinar with our two presenters, Mrs. Heather Hulse and Mr. Michael Connolly. Quick disclaimer for the ARC of Lehigh and Northampton counties. Our department does not employ lawyers nor provide legal advice. This training or any other provided by the ARC's advocacy department does not constitute or imply the endorsement, recommendation, or favoring of the providing party or any employees or contractors acting on its behalf. This webinar is being provided for educational and informative purposes only. All right, so it is now my pleasure to introduce our two presenters. So we have here Mrs. Heather Hulse, who is a shareholder with McAndrews Law Offices in their Scranton area office, where she contributes her diverse educational and professional background. She has been a member of the firm since May of 1999. Mrs. Hulse's practice consists of special education law. With 15 years of experience, she has a broad knowledge in the area of special education and an extensive background in the area of psychology, providing her with considerable understanding to students with learning disabilities. We also are welcoming Mr. Michael Connolly, who is also a shareholder of the McAndrews Law Offices and was named Supervising Partner of Special Education in 2018. With 20 years of experience, he represents parents of children with special needs in a variety of education matters at administrative hearings and state and federal court. He later became a partner in the firm, in a firm located in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where he spent nearly a decade representing school districts throughout the state. Thank you both for your time this evening and for coming out and presenting. The Zoom is now yours.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for having us. Heather and I are both thrilled to be here, and I'm going to try and share my screen. There we go. So welcome everyone to the presentation tonight. As you can see from the title, and as Jessica had mentioned, we're going to be talking tonight about COVID Compensatory Education Services and Extended School Year Services. Some might look at that and think that's an odd combination, but there's been a lot of I think a lot of questions and some level of confusion because although the services are very different, there's some similarities in the eligibility requirements that's talked about for both. So there's been a little bit of confusion as to what is the difference between the two, and we will talk about that tonight. We'll also get into a little bit more about traditional compensatory education services that were around well before the pandemic, and kind of talk about those and contrast those in light of COVID compensatory services. And then we'll also talk about some related issues in there. So really well, let me see here if we can. There we go. So let's kind of start really at the basics. There's been a lot of confusion, I think, since March of 2020, when we had the school shut down and closure due to the pandemic, as to what is a school district's obligation to students with IEPs, eligible students, during this pandemic. Is there still a requirement to provide FAPE, and is that requirement of FAPE the same as it always was, or is it something different in the pandemic? So the short answer to that question is yes, FAPE is still required. There's been no waiver of any kind of any of the requirements under the IDEA, of any of the timelines under the IDEA. So IEPs still have to be developed, evaluations and reevaluations still need to occur. And the programming, the evaluations, the services, all continue to need to be appropriate and to provide a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE. Congress had the opportunity to consider whether or not there were going to be any waivers, and gave the U.S. Department of Education the opportunity to weigh in on it. And they ultimately decided that there would be no waiver. So FAPE is still there. It's the same thing as it always was, an individualized program designed to meet a child's unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. I'm going to skip over a second the whole idea about virtual versus in-person instruction, and we'll hop back to that. But as I mentioned earlier, the timelines for completions of evaluations, reevaluations, and IEPs, that none of that has been changed or modified by the federal government. So that remains in place. I know there was some, back in the early phases, there was some confusing guidance that came out from the Pennsylvania Department of Education, particularly on evaluations and whether evaluations needed to be done, that I think caused some school districts some problems unnecessarily. So I think there was some confusion that they later over the summer kind of corrected. But all those timelines are still in person. So the big question really comes down to in this question is, what does that FAPE really look like? And in particular, the idea of in-person instruction versus virtual instruction. And as I'm sure every professional and every parent and family member sitting in on this Zoom tonight remembers that in March, all of a sudden, everybody's world changed and school districts were mandated to be closed. And it really was from March through the end of last school year, that 1920 school year, it was all virtual. The level of virtual instruction varied greatly as far as what that looked like across the state, and from district to district. They could be, even neighboring districts could be vastly different as far as what that virtual instruction was, from posting some assignments online, or using Schoology or something of that nature to post assignments for students to download and do on their own, with maybe some office hours during the week with teachers, to providing a level of asynchronous instruction or video recorded instruction that students could play, to providing a full day of synchronous live instruction on Zoom or some other sort of similar video platform. So it varied greatly as far as what that looked like. And now this year, it varies again. Schools are no longer mandated to be closed, but schools are making individual decisions. And again, some are fully open and operational. Others are on a hybrid model, and there are others that spent most of the year, and even still, primarily virtual. So it ranges, and the question becomes, particularly now, can my child have in-person instruction if that's what they need? And we think the answer to that question is a resounding yes. That if that's what the child needs, that's what the child is entitled to. Nothing's been waived during this time period. School districts aren't mandated to be closed at the moment. So that need for virtual, if demonstrated, is certainly something that I think a student is entitled to during this period of pandemic. And I think it's something that most students, frankly, regardless of whether or not they have special education needs, a lot of kids are struggling with this virtual format for them, for their education. For kids with special needs, I think it's a lot worse. It's a lot more difficult for them, and it has a lot more of an impact for kids that have special needs and learn differently. Obviously, that can vary depending on the nature and the severity of the need, but I would venture to guess that for the vast majority of special education students, virtual instruction doesn't really work for them. It certainly doesn't work well. In Pennsylvania, there have not yet been any cases, special education cases, whether due process hearings or federal, that I'm aware of that have come out specifically on this issue. Although there have been some cases in some other states on this issue. There's one federal case out of New York, the state of New York, and there's several administrative, similar to our due process hearing process here in Pennsylvania, but in California, that have come out on this issue. And they have all found that the virtual programming in those particular cases for those particular students were inappropriate, and that the students needed in-person instruction in order to receive a FAPE, and were awarded compensatory education for that period of time, or where districts were awarded to try and find individuals to provide in-person instruction. And if the schools weren't open, because obviously New York, California, I think they're still under mandated school closures in both of those states, the idea was potentially in-home services or providing services through contracted providers that would be willing to provide those in-person instruction, noting that there's nothing about the school forcing a school building to be closed that would necessarily prevent that instruction from occurring in the home by a teacher, at least under their state mandated closures. Pennsylvania, the mandated closure is no longer in place, so certainly that would be possible under Pennsylvania's laws. So while nothing's yet happened in Pennsylvania, it is happening in some other places. Heather, I don't know if there's anything you've seen or any other thoughts you would have to add on here.
No, I think you did a great job, Mike. I think you covered everything, and I appreciate you mentioning those cases from California and New York. I think they're really important. I think that's the direction that Pennsylvania is going to head as well.
Yeah, I think so as well. Oops, did I go the wrong? Sorry. There we go, Heather.
Okay, so what if my child wasn't provided FAPE during the pandemic? And I think particularly during when schools were mandated to be closed. So Mike, if you could click to the next slide. I think we need to first discuss the difference between compensatory education versus COVID compensatory services. And if you could click to the next slide, we're going to go into detail on that. Okay, so first I'd like to discuss what's compensatory education. And many of you may know this, but I think it's important to really go into detail so we can parse out the difference between compensatory education and COVID compensatory services, CCS services. So compensatory education it's a bank of hours. Sometimes it's a fund of money that is negotiated or through federal courts is ordered. Parents can use to obtain private educational services at the school district's expense. And these are to remedy or make up for the past failures of the district. So it's an equitable remedy designed to provide educational based on the educational and functional deficits that the student has suffered due to a district's failure to provide an appropriate educational program. It's a remedy to make up for those past failures. So how is compensatory education determined? What are the considerations? How do we decide? How does a hearing officer, a special education hearing officer, determine what is owed to a student? And this can happen in several different ways, depending on the facts of the case, depending on sometimes the hearing officer's preferences, the arguments that the attorneys make. One of the considerations may be the amount of time and duration that the student was denied a free appropriate public education. So in other words, how many hours per day or how many hours per week was the student not provided an appropriate education? Another consideration is reasonably calculated to provide educational benefit that would likely have accrued from special education services that the school district should have supplied in the first place. So what this means is what compensatory education would be reasonably calculated, would essentially make sense based on the student's needs to place the student where they would have been had they not been denied a free appropriate public education. Another consideration that's often made is what services, if any, were required to place the child in the same position he or she would have been, but for the district's violations. So what does the student need to be in the same place they would be had they not been denied a free appropriate public education? The student's specific educational deficits resulting from the loss of a free appropriate public education, and the specific compensatory measures needed to best correct those deficits. So in this case, what would be looked at is, or considered, are the deficits the student has as a result, and provide those specific services, whatever's needed to address those deficits. And finally, another consideration how compensatory education would be determined is what service the student needs to elevate him to the position, him or her to the position they would have occupied absent the school district's failure. So this would essentially be an assessment of what the student needs to be where he would have been had the student not provided an appropriate education. In terms of when compensatory education is awarded, how is that accessed, and what does that look like? Parents would determine how compensatory education is used. However, it does need to fall under a legitimate educational expense or service. So the parents would seek out the services. It might be items as well, devices, it might be equipment, things that can help a student with whatever their educational needs are. And again, remembering that education is quite broad. So whatever they believe the student needs, so long as they're considered an legitimate educational expense. So for example, if a student has speech and language needs, parents can obtain private speech and language services, and the Compensatory Education Fund could pay for those services. Again, this is to make up for the district's past failures. And sometimes, I think it is important to point out that sometimes hearing officers, they can and do limit what it can be used for depending on the student's needs. So for example, if the case was pursued because a student was denied speech and language services, occupational therapy services, and physical therapy services. So just related to related services, and the position of the parent was not that academic services had been denied. In that instance, a hearing officer may award compensatory education and limit it in terms of what it could be provided for. That doesn't happen often, but I do think it does happen sometimes. Is compensatory education an available remedy during the pandemic? Yes, of course it is. If the district has failed to offer a student what they need to make meaningful educational progress, then compensatory education would be the remedy. So talking a little bit about COVID compensatory services then in comparison to that. So CCS, oh, excuse me.
I'm sorry, I just want to jump in one.
Sure, of course.
Heather. In kind of looking at compensatory education and looking at, at FAPE, and just kind of thinking about what when we say a child's been denied FAPE, or the school district failed to provide, an inappropriate or an appropriate program, what are we talking about? What does that mean? What are you looking at, I guess, to determine if that program was or wasn't appropriate, or child was or wasn't denied FAPE? And I think you're looking at, progress. Has the child made progress on the goals and objectives that are identified in the IEP, and is that progress what you would expect the child to make over whatever period of time that we're looking at. And that's not a black and white answer, because it depends on, again, the nature and severity of the disability, the ability levels of the student. That all comes into play. For some students, a year's progress in a year's time might be reasonable. For other students, it could be more than a year's time, or more than a year's progress in a year's time. And for others, it could be less. So it really depends on the individual student. But you're also looking at, are all the needs addressed in the program? Does he have goals in every area that he or she should have goals in? Do they have all the supports that they need in the IEP? Does it meet the needs identified in the student's last evaluation? Is that last evaluation thorough and comprehensive, and did it assess all areas of need, or did it not? And there may be a whole bunch of needs that we don't even know about because they haven't been identified and included in the IEP. And is the IEP itself being implemented the way it's supposed to be implemented? That one's probably the toughest one, oftentimes, to prove or look at, because really the only folks that can answer that question in most cases are the folks that are actually implementing, because they're the ones that see it day in, day out. So the only way, most often the only way that maybe there are implementation issues is that lack of progress. Everything else is in there, it's all where it's supposed to be, but progress isn't being made. That might be an indication of a lack of implementation. But those are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we're talking about was FAPE being denied. And then the only other point that I wanted to add is, when we're looking at the different things that and I think this is important for when we kind of compare to COVID, the different things that Heather mentioned as far as the considerations for compensatory education. It really breaks down to two ways in figuring out compensatory education. One is what they refer to as an hour-by-hour approach, which is, this is what would have been an appropriate program, and you would have received this many hours of reading instruction. This is what you got. That was appropriate. That wasn't appropriate. So it's just a straight calculation. And the other is that last part that Heather talked about what services the student needs to be put back into the position that he would have been, which is what they often refer to as a make whole approach. So you're trying to make the student whole for not having received FAPE in the first place. And I think having that kind of context is good for when we get to COVID compensatory services and talk about, well, what does that look like? How do we figure out that? So I'll shut up.
No, please don't. Just to piggyback on that, your discussion about what is a denial of a free appropriate public education and what kinds of things to look for. There's just one other thing I'd add, which I think is it happens quite often, and it's often parents aren't necessarily thinking about this. So I think it's a good thing to mention. Let's say your student has a reading disability and the district is providing a research-based program in a learning support environment. Pay careful attention to what that program is. Research it, look it up and see, is it addressing your child's specific needs? So for example, if your child has struggles with reading comprehension, but they're providing a program that doesn't address reading comprehension, it addresses reading fluency, which is how quickly you read, then there's a problem. They're not providing a free appropriate public education. So I think that's an area that's a little more technical and specific, but it is an area that we see frequently where denials of FAPE occur and impact students tremendously. You're wasting time thinking that your child's getting what they need when they're truly not. Just anything to add on that, Mike?
No, I agree. That is an important consideration that often gets missed. And you know what, I think we'll at some point want to talk a little bit about you know what, we'll do it maybe more when we get into COVID, because there's been some question about that idea of whether or not compensatory education is available during the pandemic, and there's been some legal challenges and arguments that have occurred in Pennsylvania. And we actually have this, one of the few things about COVID we actually have a decision on in Pennsylvania. But maybe we'll talk about that a little bit down the line when we get into some of the COVID compensatory services. So you know, why don't we start there with what is COVID compensatory services? So this, I mean, it's really different than it seems to be very different. And a lot of what we're going to say when it comes to COVID compensatory services is our interpretation based on the guidance that has come out and how this all came about, because we don't know. I mean, there has not been any decision that I'm aware of anywhere in the United States to date on what COVID compensatory services are, how it works, what it's supposed to look like, or anything like that. So unlike compensatory education, which is a remedy that kind of evolved through the courts, through the court system, and is a well-established remedy, COVID compensatory services is something completely new that originally stems from the U.S. Department of Education's guidance when we first had the school closures back in March. And I really think they were looking at this COVID compensatory service to address what they envisioned and hoped to be a short-term closure of schools, and not what it has turned into in Pennsylvania and in many states across the country. But it stemmed from their initial guidance that if you were to close, if you closed or during a closure for a pandemic, of providing these compensatory services once a student returns, and states like Pennsylvania then gravitated to that and gave their own guidance as far as what this is to look like. So this is really a new creation by a combination of the U.S. Department of Education and at least as being interpreted in Pennsylvania by the Pennsylvania Department of Education. But there's no regulation, there's no case law. Frankly, there's really no law whatsoever about COVID compensatory services. It is as a result of guidance from the Department of Education. And frankly, guidance doesn't necessarily have to be accepted by courts. It can be, and it can be persuasive, but it's guidance. So exactly how this is all, the COVID compensatory services are all going to shake out is yet to be determined. But remember, as Heather mentioned in the earlier slide, you are not limited to COVID compensatory services to remedy failures to provide FAPE, including the failure to not provide in-person instruction while this pandemic is going on. To this, you still have available to you as parents the remedy of compensatory education. So this does not replace compensatory education, in my opinion. It's something in addition to or something different from compensatory education. But essentially, they are services that the IEP team determines are needed for a student to fix or to remedy a loss in a particular skill or behavior or a lack of progress made on goals as a result of the failure to provide FAPE because of the COVID shutdown, so that whatever alternative virtual type education that was being provided while schools were closed was insufficient, and it resulted in either this loss of skill, a regression, if you will, or a failure to make progress, and that they are supposed to first wait for a period of time, which they refer to as the recoupment period, when the student comes back, to see if they catch up in any way on these skills. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But that's generally what it is. Eligibility and what it looks like seems to be determined, in my opinion, by the IEP team. It's not clear because, again, we don't have any cases on this yet, or any real solid guidance on this yet, and it's new. So we don't know for sure, but that's all the indications from the guidance seem to, at least to me, to suggest that this is something determined by the IEP team. Can whatever that decision is be challenged by a parent? Again, we don't have guidance on this, but given that a parent can challenge any other aspect of a decision made by an IEP team, I can't imagine why they would not also be able to challenge a determination about COVID compensatory services. As far as who provides it, what it exactly looks like, again, it sounds like it is much more a provision of services by the district to make up for or address this regression, as opposed to traditional compensatory education, which is the ability for the parent to go out and purchase private educational services at the district's expense, or at least that's what it appears to me to be like. I don't know what your thoughts are, Heather.
No, I agree. I think that's it's the school district personnel, or the LEA's personnel, local educational agencies personnel, would provide those services. And I think also the difference is they could be provided during the school year, during the summer, on weekends. I think there's no clear cut, but if districts are willing to provide those services after school hours, or on the weekends, and in addition to, let's say, the students also eligible for ESY, they could also get CCS services over the summer. I also wanted to point out, Mike, I think in my experience so far, and I think you're right, that it is something that looks like the IEP team should be determining whether CCS services are provided to a student. But so far in my experience, I am hearing and seeing that school districts are sort of making this determination on their own, and parents are getting a letter or a NOREP indicating that their child was not eligible for CCS services. The determination was already made. So I think that's just really important to point out, because I think when we get into the next slide, you're going to see why that's not really appropriate for them to be doing.
Right, and the guidance that we do have, the limited guidance that is out there, suggests that it's the IEP team that makes this decision. So IEP team, would include the teachers, the LEA, and the parents in that decision. So it really should be that team decision. Obviously, the district ultimately makes the call, just like they do with the IEP, and issue the NORP. I have to say, I've also found it a little interesting. I know it's early yet. Some districts have been making this decision, but every NORP that I have seen so far has been either a rejection of an ineligibility for compensatory COVID services, and or a very limited amount. I've seen like 10 hours of compensatory. And obviously for some kids that may be true, but I just find it really hard, just given all the studies that are out there about how hard this has been on students virtually. And again, this is not a blame obviously the school districts can't control a pandemic. We understand that, but neither can the parents and the student. And the students have really suffered educationally, and all the research that they've done shows that. So I struggle with starting to see the ones that are coming in seem to be consistently reaching that conclusion of not eligible for services. So I struggle with seeing that, because I would think more would be eligible than not, given what we know about how students generally, never mind students with special needs, have responded to full virtual education like this. So I think, although Pennsylvania doesn't have a lot of case law on it, I have a feeling that it's it is headed in the direction that we will eventually be getting that case law and some clarification on the issue.
I would agree. Should we talk about the next slide?
Yep, and there you go. It should be shown on your screen.
So the factors and sources of data that an IEP team should be considering when determining if a student needs COVID compensatory services. So the first one there, the levels of academic and functional performance, including levels of performance on all IEP goals prior to the mandatory school closures as compared to the student's current level of performance as measured from the baseline data collection. So what does that mean? So we would look at where they were with their IEP goals when the shutdown occurred, where they are now, and compare those to the baseline goal, which is where they started from. So if we see that there's not a whole lot of progress there, then that would seem to indicate that it would be appropriate for the school district to be offering COVID compensatory services. Another factor is information and observations from teachers, related service providers, parents, caregivers, and other family members. So I think this, going back to what we were just talking about, that the IEP team, needs to be making this decision. If the team needs to consider the input from all these people, I think it's impossible for school districts to just go ahead and be issuing letters saying we've made that determination without giving. So I think it's important for parents to say, well, wait a minute, I didn't have the opportunity to provide input, to provide my information, to provide my observations. So I think that's really important to make sure you're aware of that, that you need to be doing that. And I think it's also important for parents to be prepared to provide whatever detailed input they can on what concerns they have with regard to their child's progress. And one thing I've been suggesting to clients that I'm working with is taking pictures of their students' work. We're in a virtual setting, and back when the school shut down, most of the schools were implementing some type of virtual instruction. So the parents had the opportunity, more opportunities, I think, than we ever did before, to actually see what kind of schoolwork our children are completing. And, I encourage them to take pictures of what their children were doing, so we could demonstrate that there's a lack of progress. If there is such a lack of progress. The students' ability to access remote learning opportunities and special education services while local educational agencies were using alternative learning models due to the closure, the COVID pandemic closure. So if a student was unable to access education because, for example, maybe they have significant cognitive needs. Maybe they need hand-over-hand assistance. Maybe their executive functioning needs are so significant that being able to attend to virtual instruction was something that they weren't able to do. Maybe their social, emotional, and behavioral needs were so significant that they weren't able to access their education in a virtual fashion. So these would be red flags to say, okay, well, this student really needed that in-person instruction, which we weren't able to provide at that time. So this is a situation where we should be offering COVID compensatory services. So again, if your child, wasn't able to access even what the district was offering, I think that's a red flag that we should be thinking about those CCS services. Another factor, the students' engagement in the learning process while the LEAs were using alternative learning models due to the COVID pandemic. So I think this one's very similar to the last point. Again, if your child was not able to engage in that learning process, then they likely weren't getting what they needed, and they weren't making progress. So should be thinking about COVID compensatory services. Another factor is the amount of skill and/or behavior loss and/or lack of progress the student experienced while the local educational agencies were using alternative learning models due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this would be another area. Again, I think it's important for parents to take pictures, videos, if that makes sense. During closures, parents had access to their work. So again, if you're able to provide, if you're able to access that kind of data, because I think that really is data, you can demonstrate that your child hasn't been making the progress in skills and or behaviors. And again, COVID compensatory services should be provided in that situation. School districts' IEP teams should also be looking at historical data regarding the student's ability to recoup lost skills and or behavior. So we look at past experience. Has this student struggled before when we've had winter breaks or over the summer? If they've had periods of breaks, do they struggle with regressing and recouping? So very similar, and we're going to talk about extended school year in particular, but if the student has a history and is an ESY eligible student, then it is likely that they would suffer the same kind of skill loss and inability to recoup it in a meaningful manner that would warrant COVID compensatory services. Services provided while the local educational agencies were using alternative models. So we should be looking at what services, when the schools shut down, what services were being provided and how. So I had many students that I represented that school districts weren't providing, even though they were providing virtual instruction, they weren't providing any related services. So if there was no speech and language services provided, no occupational therapy services, physical therapy services, counseling, that would be a major red flag that, okay, my child wasn't getting any of those services. So now we need to look at, how do we make up? How is it that my child made progress without being provided with those services at all? Or also, were those services being provided in a manner that your child wouldn't be able to benefit from? So again, for example, let's say they needed hand-over-hand assistance, or speech and language services were not meaningful because your child had significant executive functioning needs and was having trouble attending to the speech and language therapist. So I think we, look at what services were provided during that time frame and how those services were being provided. Data collected through progress monitoring and progress reports. So looking at the data and seeing if your child has made progress. But I think we also need to really consider making sure that the data that they're collecting is, number one, appropriate data, measuring what we need to measure, and it was collected appropriately, that if we're looking at data, we want it to be measuring what it's intended to measure, and that the data was collected in a way that we can actually measure what it was intended to measure. And if you have questions about what the district's providing you in terms of progress monitoring, ask questions and don't feel, oh, this is a stupid question. I look like I don't understand. That probably is because there's something there that doesn't make sense. So it's important for that, for parents to say, well, what is it that you're measuring? How was this being measured? And if it doesn't make sense to you, then, ask those questions to get more information so you fully understand what was happening. And then finally, results from informal and formal assessments. And again, I think it's important. These are things that parents often don't have a lot of familiarity with. So ask questions. What does this mean? What does this assess? What do you do to assess this specific? So if you have an assessment that was given, tell me about that. Tell me what you did to assess my child's needs. You can ask those questions, and school districts can provide those answers to you. Also, we have a world of information at our fingertips. Research what assessments were completed and see if that's actually measuring what it's supposed to, what you think it's measuring. So for example, let's say they're telling you your child is doing fine based on this assessment in speech and language, and your child struggles with pragmatics in terms of speech and language, and that would be areas of social language. But the assessment that they gave had nothing to do with that. It had to do with expressive language and receptive language. So those are things that you want to make sure you're understanding. Are they actually assessing my child's specific areas of need in whatever, whatever component we're talking about? So Mike, do you have anything that I missed there?
No, I think you covered really the different kinds of data that you're gonna look for to make that determination. And a lot of this data in many respects is very similar to the data you would be looking at to determine whether the more traditional compensatory education is also owed because FAPE wasn't provided. Looking at those the testing data, looking at data on progress monitoring, and the same types of information that you're talking about here are the same that you'd be looking for the traditional comp ed, and I think you hit them. So how does a team figure out eligibility and calculate CCS? Again, this is an area where guidance is very light from the Pennsylvania Department of Education on what they're saying school districts have to do. We know that it needs to be done on an individual basis, as do all things when it comes to kids with special education needs and IEPs. Everything is on an individualized basis. Again, the team we talked about a little bit earlier, the team's got to look at the loss of skill or regression, lack of progress due to that inability to provide FAPE using the virtual platform or whatever alternate learning methods they used during the school shutdown, and whether or not the student was able to recoup the lost skill or behavior or make meaningful progress during any period in which the student received services after coming back. So that recoupment period, and if there is still lost skill or still lack of progress after that recoupment period, then they would be entitled to the CCS. Now they talk about that recoupment period being no longer than the first 3 months following school resuming normal operations. So what does normal operations mean? Again, they don't define in the guidance what normal operations mean. So we get into a dispute. Does that mean my child's coming back for hybrid? Is that normal operations? Or my child with special needs, you're having, so there's a lot of schools that might be on hybrid and kids are coming every other day or 2 days a week or 3 days a week. But your child with an IEP is coming 4 or 5 days a week. In person. They're coming all the days that hybrid, that the in-person is available and the school is open. Is that normal? Or is it not until, COVID no longer has the impact of the extent to which schools are open and in-person instruction is going on, and the entire student body is permitted to come back and teachers are back in person and they're all sitting in the cafeteria and going to football games on Friday nights, and is that normal? And again, it's not clear. Normal suggests to me that at least your student is receiving services that are more consistent to what they were getting, that in-person instruction. That would just be the natural definition of normal. But here's the thing, I don't, and Heather, you tell me if you disagree, I don't really get all that caught up in this COVID compensatory services. And the reason why is because you're entitled to compensatory education anyway. Compensatory education, there's no recoupment period. You don't have to worry about, did the student make progress when he came back to school? Not an issue for compensatory education. Was FAPE denied during the period at issue? If the answer to that is yes, the student is entitled to compensatory education. And all this other stuff that we're talking about is nice, but not relevant to compensatory education. So I don't really get caught up too much in this COVID compensatory services and getting worried about the, when do they do it? How do they do it? If there's been a lack of progress, there's been a regression in skill because of what's gone over. As far as I'm concerned, you may very well be entitled to traditional compensatory education, and to remedy that, irrespective of whether you get any COVID compensatory services or not. That's kind of my view on that. And there has been argument in Pennsylvania about whether or not these COVID compensatory services kind of trump the idea of compensatory education at all. And whether that you only now have to do these compensatory services for the period of the pandemic, and as a result of not going back to quote unquote normal operations, it means that we can't have any discussion about compensatory education or anything like that. That argument has been had several times in Pennsylvania in the administrative process since this has all started. And every hearing officer that has heard it, which is most, I don't know that it's all at this point, but most of them, has resoundingly rejected that argument that we can't have a discussion about compensatory education because they haven't gone through the recoupment process, because you haven't gotten back to normal operations. Comp Ed, they've all held compensatory education continues to be an available remedy to parents despite COVID compensatory services, and we can move forward with that because all this stuff about recoupment and getting back to normal operations is entirely irrelevant to whether or not there's an entitlement to traditional compensatory education. So that's why I don't get too wrapped up in this. Frankly, from what I know of COVID compensatory services, I think traditional compensatory education is a better remedy, a better fix for families and students than the COVID compensatory services. To the extent that you get these, it's nice on top. But I would be much more, from my perspective, much more concerned with compensatory education. It gives the parents more leeway as far as how it gets used, for what areas it gets used, to address what skill areas, and I just think it's a better remedy for the student than, at least from what I can tell. Now, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but from the guidance that we have, I would rather have compensatory education than COVID compensatory services. And there's just benefits to compensatory education from my perspective, for the family, that are not necessarily there based on what we know about these COVID compensatory services. Again, just to follow up, that if a student is determined to need CCS by a school district, by an IEP team, the team then determines the type and the amount and how it will be delivered. Now, the COVID compensatory services should not supplant the student's current IEP, what that means is they should not be providing it in place of services that the student is already entitled to in their IEP and already receiving in their IEP. So does that mean they can't get it during the school day? Not necessarily. It depends on the timing and what the student is missing. If they're providing it instead of health, and health is not related to the disability or the IEP, and the parent's okay with the student not receiving health, and it's not going to hurt graduation credit requirements or the like, sure, you can do the services during health class. If the child is supposed to receive reading instruction, 5 times a week for a class period as part of their IEP, COVID compensatory services cannot be provided during that reading instruction. It can't supplant the special education services and programming that the student is getting. It must supplement the services. And districts also need to be conscious about, to the extent that they are providing them during the school day, that whether or not the way in which those services are being provided is impacting the least restrictive environment. So is it changing their level of, so you're pulling them out of regular education class and they're getting one-to-one support, or they're going to be in a small group with a special education teacher. It's now really special education. You may just have changed from itinerant to supplement, or supplemental to full-time level of services. So that also needs to be looked at in determining how and when compensatory COVID services are provided. Heather, I don't know if you have anything you would add to that.
Well, just that I would agree with you that I focus on compensatory education, and I think it makes sense. Again, there's no waiver. There has been no waiver through this entire pandemic for districts and local educational agencies must still provide a free appropriate public education. So why would a parent wait till we go back to, let's say you're in a school district where only virtual instruction is being offered, but your child needs that in-person instruction. So your school district is not back to normal function. Why would we wait and have your child continue to not make progress? The gap widens and widens. Who knows when we're going to return to normal operations. So we move in and we make sure the student gets an appropriate program moving forward, a prospective free appropriate public education, and then you pursue whatever compensatory education is owed. And I think if CCS services are being offered, that would just be an addition to the denial of the compensatory education due to the denial of FAPE.
Agreed. All right, so now we're talking about the differences between CCS and ESY, and I will turn it back to Heather.
Sure. So extended school year services, I think that they're more specific in terms of what they are, when they occur, how they occur, as opposed to CCS services. So extended school year services are special education or related services provided to students with disabilities, and it's services that go beyond your typical 180 school days. So, and we're going to talk about the factors that determine whether a student receives extended school year services, but if they're determined to meet one of those factors, those 7 factors, then they would be eligible for extended school year services. Those services would occur over the summer. And the idea is that, we want to continue services throughout the school year. Again, and we'll talk more in detail about why those services would occur. So, and again, the reason is because in order for a child to receive a free appropriate public education, these extended school year services are needed. With extended school year services, students with severe disabilities receive those. A decision would need to be made by February 28th. So again, it's very different in terms of CCS services, where we have a determination is being made 3 months after we return to normal operations. This is happening annually, and in students' IEPs, there should be a separate determination made for whether the student is eligible for extended school year services, and every year that happens on February 28th. So I think in the case where if anyone's concerned, should I be getting CCS as opposed to extended school year services, those extended school year services should have been determined by February 28th before we went into school closure. Now, there may be a question of whether that determination wasn't appropriately made or it was incorrectly made. Then the next date that's important is a NOREP, a Notice of Recommended Educational Placement, must be issued by March 31st of every year. So parents should expect to receive a NOREP with regard to their child's eligibility for extended school year services.
Something something that I think is interesting with this is, obviously, as Heather said, they're 2 different things, right? ESY and COVID compensatory services. But there's that similarity in it in one of the eligibility requirements that we're going to talk about for ESY in a second, which is a regression recoupment analysis. And whether they regress over break, a student regresses in skill over break, and then has difficulty recouping that skill when they come back from break in a reasonable amount of time, and therefore would be eligible for extended school year services, which is very similar to what we just went through about COVID. So to me, if you have a student who's consistently been determined eligible for extended school year services, and there's no reason to think that they wouldn't be this summer, how could a school possibly conclude that? I just think if the data is showing that they're going to regress over breaks, and now we've had 6 months, and we're talking about a summer, right? Or where you're collecting data. Now we've had March to May. Maybe the ESY was virtual. Maybe you've been in school most of this year virtual, or had limited amount of direct instruction. To me, I think it's hard pressed to then not say they're eligible for COVID compensatory services. And I see them as two distinct things. It's not an either or. So you could be eligible for your extended school year program, and that should be based on extended school year services. And then compensatory COVID compensatory services on top of that could be the possibility. So they're very two different things. I just think that's interesting, though. I think that intersect of that one eligibility requirement could really make it difficult to say eligible for one but not for the other, and I think to some degree vice versa. All right, so the factors that Heather alluded to, again, as we talked about the idea of regression and recoupment analysis, there's regression and recoupment in regard to IEP goals. So essentially that is whether the student's difficulties with the regression and recoupment make it unlikely that the student will maintain skills or behaviors relevant to their IEP goals. So it's different than just the regression and recoupment difficulty. It's whether that's also going to add to the ability to maintain skills in the IEP goals. So there's also another factor to consider is the extent that the student has mastered a particular skill or behavior related to a goal at the point that the programming is going to be interrupted, and is that going to have a impact on their ability to maintain that skill that they just mastered at that mastery level, is another one. The extent to which a skill or behavior is particularly related to and necessary for the student to meet the IEP goals of self-sufficiency and independence from caretakers. Is it particularly crucial to that, and is that going to cause a problem by not having services over the break? The extent to which interruptions in educational programming result in students withdraw from the learning process. So where a student, after we have break over the Christmas and New Year holiday break, spring break, Thanksgiving break, you have all these breaks, and now we've got a 3-month break over the summer. Is that those kind of breaks? Does that make it very difficult for the student to re-engage in the educational progress, regardless of regression and recoupment on skills? That can be another factor for eligibility. And the last one is the severity of the student's disability. So severity alone, if the disability is severe, such as autism, pervasive development disorder, serious emotional disturbance, a severe intellectual disability, degenerative impairments, and severe multiple disabilities, that in and of itself can qualify a student for extended school years. Again, it's not just the label, but the severity of it, and those different areas, disability classifications tend to have a level of severity that could get you to that eligibility classification on its own. So that's generally the different factors that would determine whether or not somebody is eligible for special education or for extended school year services.
And I just want, before we move on to the next slide, Mike, I just wanted to point out one thing in my experience. I'm wondering if you have the same experience, but you know, school districts, LEAs that I've encountered over the years, and even parents, I think when they hear about extended school year services, the go-to almost always is regression recoupment. It's exceptionally rare to hear about those last 4 factors. And I think it's, you know, that's why I want to stress those that, you know, to this group, and so that people are aware that there are 4 additional factors out there that I have seen, you know, students fall under and not be offered extended school year services. So I think it's really important for us to remember that there are 7 factors, and it's not just about regression and recoupment.
Yeah, I agree completely that that's, I would say 95% of the IEP meetings that I go to or hear about where extended school year is an issue, they always talk about regression recoupment at those meetings. And there's always, not always, but often there's at least some level of data that they're looking at to make the determination. Whether there's an agreement or not is a different question, but it's at least discussed, where the other factors are often just not even discussed, glossed over, not talked about. And it's really important for both the parent's perspective and the school district's perspective to make sure that you're looking at those. They may not be eligible under those classifications, but you want, or those factors, but you want to make sure that the IEP team is looking at all of those factors at least annually to make that determination. So yes, I agree.
Okay, so sources of information for the IEP team to consider when making extended school year services determinations. There's a few. Progress on goals and consecutive IEPs. So if you're seeing, for example, IEP goals in your child's IEPs being repeated, you know, over the course of year or more than that, or even just modified, you know, just a little bit, that would indicate that there's a problem, and extended school year services should likely be provided. We should see progress on goals. We should see goals change. We should see goals being met, and you know, so you want to look at those consecutive IEPs to see if that's happening. Progress reports from team members. So again, you know, it's the whole IEP team, and if someone at the table is saying something that you're not sure you agree with or you don't understand, ask questions, make sure you understand. And, you know, especially with regard to progress reports, because if you don't ask questions, you're not always going to get the information. They might just say something like, you know, your child's making progress in reading. Well, you might feel my child's not making progress in reading, and I'm not sure where you're seeing progress in reading. So make sure you express those concerns and ask where you're seeing progress. How are you measuring progress? What area are you measuring? You know, how is that data being collected? So, you know, you want to make sure you're you know, getting all the information you need. Reports by parents of negative changes in adaptive behavior or other skill areas. So again, I always tell parents, you're the most important IEP team member. You're the parent, you're the child's parent. So be specific and detailed as you can. You know, express your concerns. You know, if you're seeing any negative changes in adaptive behavior or other skill areas, make sure you make that known. And if you have evidence of that, present that. Medical or other agency reports indicating degenerative type difficulties. One thing that I think is, I know it sounds like, well, yeah, of course, but I don't know how many times I have a parent say, here's a medical report and it has this information that's really pertinent to the child's education. And I say, did you provide this to your child's school district? And they'll say, I don't know, or I didn't. So you want to make sure you're providing any important outside information to school district, because if you don't provide it, they can't consider it. And I would suggest providing that if you can via email, so that you have a record that you provided it to them. Challenges that are increased during breaks in educational services. So again, you as the parent, you're the person who's going to see your child during the break, and you're going to see those challenges. So you want to make sure you bring these up at the meeting and discuss these and be specific, and take notes of your child during those breaks about those challenges that you're seeing. Observations and opinions by educators, parents, and other team members. Again, I think this is very similar to what we talked about, just in terms of providing that information. Be specific. Test results. Again, you want to make sure you ask questions and you understand those test results. Don't just because it's something that might sound like another language, don't be afraid to say, well, what is this? What does this mean? And what does this assess? And ask questions. Criterion reference tests, same thing. Curriculum-based assessments. Curriculum-based assessments are assessments that are of the student's curriculum. So, understand that, not that they're certainly meaningful, but they're not normed. They're not standardized. So, I would think that we're not going to only be looking at curriculum-based assessments. And if that's the case, then you want to bring that concern to the table, that we need to be looking at other test results, and ecological life skills assessments as well. So I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
No, I think it's, all that's important. And if you're having a discussion about eligibility for extended school year services, and there's not specific data being discussed, then I think the conversation needs to be, do we have data to support whatever conclusion we're coming to? And if we don't, how do we go about getting that data before we make a determination about eligibility? Because it's really important. And that conversation should really occur prior to the meeting where eligibility is going to be determined. A meeting schedule that, hey, can I get the data that we're going to be discussing so I can look at that before the discussion and have a meaningful participation in that discussion about eligibility. And if the data doesn't exist, then there needs to be a conversation of, can we collect that data and can we get it prior to the meeting? Do we need to change the meeting date? But we need that data to be able to make that determination. And it's important to ask those questions and to make sure the data is there. And if not, to get it so that it's there. And really, a lot of this data should really be data that's kind of driving every IEP meeting that you have, as far as how we're developing the IEP, how we're coming up with goals and objectives and specially designed instruction. If you don't have this kind of data, I think it makes having an IEP meeting and having a meaningful IEP come out of it difficult, if not impossible, because this is the kind of stuff that you're basing all your decisions about an IEP on.